All right, guys, welcome back to Bible 365 with Kathy Carter. And today is day 26. I always have to look, I can't memorize that. So today's day 26. And in day 26, we are going from over Job 26 through 29. And yesterday, I did, if you were with me yesterday, I did a ton of going back to go forward. So I'm trying not to do too much of that today, but I do want you to know a little bit about where we've come from. So before I do that, I want to just remind you what we're here for. We are going over the 1 year chronological Bible reading plan, which means we're reading the Bible every day for the next year. If you need to take a little bit longer, that's fantastic. And that is all fine and well. But I just really want to encourage you to keep reading and stay in your Bible. Don't give up. If you've missed a couple of days, come back in. We are officially in our second book in the Bible. So we finished the book of Genesis and we are now kind of smack in the middle of the book of Job. And so in the book of Job, what we have seen so far, and this was, I feel like this is the foundation of where we are now, is that uh, God has seen Satan and he asked him where he was. He said, roaming the earth. And he asked, hey, did you happen to see Job? And so Satan sort of said Job, God says he's upright and he's blameless and he fears God and he shuns evil. And then Satan, excuse me, Satan says, essentially, that's all well and good because you keep protecting him. And so God released his protection from Job on his outside. So first, God released his protection from Job on his things. And so then Satan proceeds to destroy all of his things. He kills a lot of people in his family, or sets up circumstances and situations to allow his entire family to be killed, and allows all of his things to be destroyed. So he was a very rich man. And then he lost all of his camels and his sheep and his goats. And so he kind of lost anything and everything that he lived on. And so, except his wife. So his wife was with him, but his wife essentially was like, you should be shunning God at this point. But Job chooses not to. He chooses to stay faithful to who God is. So after all of that, Satan asks again and says, yeah, I know that I killed all this stuff, and he maintains his integrity. However, if we mess with this person, then he's definitely going to turn away from you. And so God then again releases the ability to sort of infect this person. And then Job gets boils all over, scabs all over, and he's just miserable all the way down, it says, to the bottom of his feet. And so he's in physical agony. So he has lost everything outwardly, and now he's in physical agony. Three friends come to meet him and sort of lament and share in his sadness, and it winds up taking a turn for the worse, where they blame Job for what has become of him, and they essentially say that he's sinful. Job continues to say he has integrity and he is not sinful, and that God sort of just got it wrong, and maybe he should be pleading his case with God. So we're sort of back and forth in this conversation with them. That's a really short synopsis, but if you have not read it so far, please go back and start in the first. I don't want you to take my word for it. I really want you to read what God puts down on the paper, because things will light up to you that don't necessarily light up to me. Those are the things that I'm really interested in, because I feel like that's what God is showing you. So now we are in chapter 26, and Job is going to be responding and replying to Bildad. Bildad was the last friend that spoke, and he essentially said, people are really, really awful. So I believe what he's doing is he's trying to convey to Job that he obviously sinned, because people are terrible. And God isn't looking on him in a good way, because he is, the very last verse in chapter 25, verse 6 is, a mortal is a maggot, a human being who is only a worm. And so he's really sort of uh, showing this vision of humans just being this horrible, wretched thing, and there's no way that they could be pleasing to God. And so now Job is going to be replying to that. So in this chapter, so again, it's in chapter 26, and Job is replying, and it looks like in verses 2 to 4, which I find interesting, because I don't know if we see a lot of this. It seems like there's some sarcasm in here. So he says, how have you helped the powerless? How have you saved the arm that is feeble? What advice you have offered to one without wisdom, and what great insight you have displayed. And so I think that he's talking about himself is the one that's the powerless, because at this point he is powerless and he is pretty broken, and they're not really helping him. They're really just, they're telling him to turn back to God, which in its essence seems really, really good. But what they're telling him is if he just needs to go and do some stuff. And if he does some stuff, then God will see that, and God will, and obviously that by stuff, I mean good things, things that are honorable to God, like feeding the poor and doing the right thing and helping your neighbor, right? They're recommending that he does that because at this point they believe that he's turned away from God and he isn't doing any of those things. And so Job is retaliating and saying, like, you're giving me really great advice, essentially. And it's pretty sarcastic. And then he says, whose spirit spoke from your mouth? So he's wondering, where are you getting this wonderful advice from? And then after that, he just follows up with 5 through 14. He just follows up some of the power of God. And so he wants them to understand and to see who God is and how powerful God is. And so I just a couple of those verses that stood out to me. Verse 8, it says, he wraps up the waters in his clouds, yet the clouds do not burst under their weight. So he's just describing. So, I mean, this is a lot of imagery, which I really like. I enjoy imagery and visual pictures. And one of the things he's doing is explaining what a cloud is. So we know a cloud scientifically, right? We know a cloud holds rainwater, and then there's a point where the rainwater comes down. And so he's discussing how God is in charge of all of this, right? God creates all this and puts all this together, right? He wraps up the waters in the clouds. So water that we would see in the ocean or in lakes or in streams, he holds that in a cloud up in the sky. So this is the power of God holding that up in the sky before the rain falls down. Even thinking about that, I feel like seeing, and this is what I think Job is trying to do, to see how miraculous God truly is, how powerful and how big and extraordinary God truly is. We look up and we see those clouds all the time, but do we recognize that God is holding them in the air, and he's holding that water and preventing that water from coming down just by the power of who he is? Another verse is in verse 10. He marks out the horizon on the faces of the waters for a boundary between light and darkness. And so if we've all, watched that sunset, again, that is something that God is completely, he created and he's completely in control of. So every time that sun sets, that's because God essentially allowed it to do so. God created a system in which that sun will set every day when it's supposed to. And then verse 14, it says, and these are but the outer fringe of his works. How faint the whisper we hear of him. Who then can understand the thunder of his power? So again, he's working this really visual thing. So these things that he just explained, all these verses, that's just a taste. So what we can see and what we know and what we understand, that's a surface, just a whisper, just a tiny little bit of the power that we can possibly understand that God has. What we can't understand is that booming power of thunder, right? Thunder is big and it's loud. And it's enough to scare you, make the earth shake in some ways, right? So we can't understand that portion of it. We only get this little bit of a taste, and we can't understand that portion of it. And so I think there's this idea of God is so much bigger, and we really need to be careful when we're talking about him. We need to be careful of what we say about who he is, because we really don't have enough wisdom about him to maybe understand him fully in some of the things that we say. So he moves right on to chapter 27, and it is Job that is still speaking. He's just sort of changing text a little bit. He's changing his the topic of the conversation. So in verse 2, it says, as surely as God lives, who has denied me justice, the Almighty who has made my life bitter, as long as I have life within me, the breath of God in my nostrils, my lips will not say anything wicked, and my tongue will not utter lies. So even though he fully believes that God has done this, and he also believes that God has done this wrongly, even though he fully believes that, he will still not speak wickedly of God. He will not say a bad thing about him. He will not deny his goodness. He will not deny his power. He will not deny his greatness. So I think that's something to be said in the character of Job, which again, going back to go forward, if we go back to chapter 1, God talks about how he's reverent, how he fears God, and how he shuns evil. So I think even in this, we can see where his reverence really comes from. And that reverence actually gives him the strength. What he held on to before all of these things happened is what gives him the strength to say these things, even in his despair, even when it's probably the worst day of his life. He can still say how powerful and how mighty God is, because he knew this long before he got trapped in this situation. Now, verse 3 to 6, like I said, he won't speak against God. Now, I want to read verse 7. He says, may my enemy be like the wicked, my adversary like the unjust. I believe that Job is talking about his friends. So I believe he's starting to think that they are wicked and they are unjust against him. He's a follower of God. They're wicked and unjust against him. So he is, in essence, praying for this, his adversary, like the unjust, be treated in that way, right? So for them to be treated in the way that the wicked are treated, the unjust are treated. So he says, for what hope have the godless when they are cut off, when God takes away their life? And so that's in verses 7 through 12. And so I think that he thinks that they should know better, and yet they are saying all of these bad things about God. And then in 13 through 23, this is what God does to the wicked. Now, a couple of chapters back, what he was saying is because one of the friends was saying, this is what he does to the wicked. We see that he punishes the wicked. We see it all around us. And Job was like, no, we don't. So I find it interesting that in here, he's sort of saying all of these things that God does do to the wicked. So a recognition. I think what he was talking about before, a lot of it is his timing, so that God does punish the wicked, but we won't necessarily see it. And so I think he recognizes that God does punish the wicked. There is a punishment for the wicked, but it's in God's timing. It's not in our timing. So we might not see it, but we know that it exists. And so when he follows up with his 13 to 23, and he talks about all these things that God will do to the wicked, it's a recognition that our God is good. Our God will punish the wicked because he's just. But it just might not be something that we see in our time. But it will be a recognition that he'll do that. Now, moving on to verse 28, or chapter 28. Still Job speaking. So Job is still in the midst of this. This, by the way, is a 6-chapter speech from Job. So even after we're done our reading today, there's going to be more of Job still speaking tomorrow. So this is a 6-chapter speaking of him. But again, he's changing text a little bit. He's changing what he's talking about. It looks like in verse 1 through 11, he's talking about fighting and digging for wisdom. So I think this is super relevant in our space and our time. Now, I want to give you some of the visuals here. So he says, he's talking about, in verse 3, it says, they search out the farthest recesses for ore in the blackest darkness. Verse 7, no bird of prey knows this hidden path. Verse 10, they tunnel through the rock. Their eyes see all its treasures. They search the sources of the rivers to bring hidden things to light. But then verse 12 says, but where can wisdom be found? So these people are digging in, again, a very visual, right? Humans are digging in tunnels. We're going all the way down into the core of the earth to try and find wisdom, right? We're racking our brains and trying to find anything to help us understand what happens in this world. And think of yourself, like I think of myself and the things that I read, right? I want to learn more. I want to understand more. I love the human condition. I love human nature. One of my questions, even this morning, when in a discussion with my husband and I, was, nature versus nurture, right? Am I like my parent because they raised me, or am I like my parent because of genetics? And I was just thinking what it would be like to do a study of, children genetically born to parents, and then children sort of adopted into a parental home, and what would those differences look like, right? But you'd have to follow several families for their entire lives. But what would that look like? Why do I crave certain things? Is it genetic or is it right? So I try and find the wisdom of that. I have all these email things that pop up to help me dive into that, like sort of psych type information that comes to me, so I can read up on why I think the way I think. I take tests to know why I do what I do. Why am I extroverted versus introverted? Why do I like big crowds versus not? Right. So these things about me, I'm fascinated with why, right? Why this is. And I think I'm not the only one. I can't imagine that I'm not the only one. As we grow, this is why we go to school, right? As we grow, we want to learn more. We want to understand more. So we're digging, we're trying to learn more. The problem that Job is showing us is where we're looking for it. Why are we looking for it anywhere outside of the being that created it? Right? This being is the one who created all wisdom. So why are we searching, with our professors, or we're searching, anywhere outside of God? And I always go back to thinking like this idea, even thinking of Tower of Babel, which we did, which is one of the readings that I did a couple of weeks ago, probably at this point. We want to know it on our own. We want to find it on our own. We want to take what we want to take, but then throw away what we want to throw away. So there's this nature of being my own God, because sometimes, and I think this book is really particular, sometimes God tells us things that we don't want to hear and especially don't want to follow. It's hard to wrap my mind around God allowing this protection off of Job, who fears and reveres and loves God and shuns evil. And then God takes his protection away so things can happen to him, to see if he will still remain, if he will still have integrity at the end of all of this, right? That's a hard thing to wrap my mind around. Does that mean that God is uncaring? Does that mean that God is unfair? And of course, I'm going to argue it doesn't, because he is the source of all of those things. And so I think it's hard for us to understand, but I think that Job is trying to draw us a picture of helping us in this understanding. So, for example, in verse 12, he starts talking about where wisdom is. So he says, verse 12, where can wisdom be found? Where does understanding dwell? And then I want to move right to verse 13. No mortal comprehends its worth. It cannot be found in the land of the living. So wisdom cannot be found in the land of the living. You don't want to ask your brother what's wise, right? Now, you might ask him some help for certain things, but God is the one who knows what's wise. In verse 16, it cannot be bought. So no matter how much you have, no matter how many animals you have, or how much money you have, or whatever, wisdom cannot be bought. It can't be purchased. And then verse 21, it says, it is hidden from the eyes of every living thing, concealed even from the birds in the sky. So then where would it possibly be? Verse 23, it says, God understands the way to it, and he alone knows where it dwells, because he views the ends of the earth, and sees everything under the heavens. When he established the force of the wind and measured out the waters, when he made a decree for the rain and a path for the thunderstorm, then he looked at wisdom and appraised it. So he created it. He looked at it. He appraised it. He's the one who knows all things. Verse 28, here it is. The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to shun evil is understanding. So searching God, finding God, knowing God is wisdom. Shunning everything that's not God, that is understanding. Now, I want to finish this up in Job 29, because that was sort of like my biggest, that was really the biggest take home for me, something that I feel like I need to dwell in a lot more. But in this next chapter, in Job 29, he starts remembering what life used to be like. I wish I could go back. How I long for those days in the past. I really want to go back. Obviously, right? I want to go back to when I had my family, when I had all my stuff. I want to go back to those days. I long for those things. I'm sure it's devastating and sad where he is. Verse 4, oh, the days when I was in my prime, right? When God's intimate friendship blessed my house. So he longs to remember those days. verse 11, I have whoever heard me spoke well of me, and those who saw me commended me. So if you remember now, he's saying, like, everybody's treating me terrible. And he says, but I remember when everyone looked up to me, when people came to me for advice. And so he remembers all those things and when he thought life would be good. So verse 18, it says, I thought I will die in my own house, my days as numerous as the grains of sand. I want to end in this area because it does end and it sort of moves into the next chapter. But ending in this area, he's longing for what used to be, and what he wants, which we all want, is just what we would consider a good life: simplicity, family, things, a joyful life, and then falling asleep and dying. We probably couldn't ask for more. We always say they lived a great life when we know that they just fell asleep and then didn't wake up the next morning. Oh, and they lived till they were, 99, 100, 101. They lived a really good life. They had a lot of family. They had, they were blessed, is one of the things that we say. And we long for that. That is not what we've been promised. I hope and pray that that could be the case for me. I certainly want that. But I need to recognize that that isn't necessarily a reality. A reality, unfortunately, is I'm not always going to get my way. I'm not always going to have an abundance of things. I'm not always going to, my kids aren't always going to please me and be exactly what I want them to be. And I think loving God and knowing that God allows these things to happen, I think there is something to be said about there being a goodness to that. And so I don't want to end on a bad note and just say suffering's part of life, suck it up, deal with it. But I want to recognize that because that's a truth about our life, then I think that we need to rejoice in that and recognize that in a way that's part of God's goodness. And there's probably a reason for that for us as human beings to grow and be closer to Him. And so that's it. That's how I'm going to end today. And then tomorrow is going to be day 27. And so we're going to move on from here. We're going to go to Job. I think it's 30. We're going to move on to Job 30 tomorrow. So keep reading, subscribe, share with as many people as possible, get a group of people to be reading together. And so we can all read this through the year and learn more and love more God and people, the people He puts in front of us.